Freeze is entering a new era within the Genshin meta. All the way back in ye olden days, it started off incredibly powerful, due to the reaction itself turning AoE content into a literal one-sided fight. Then, as more boss content became common, it started to lose its relevance since the damage as a whole couldn't keep up with other teams. 5.6 introduced Escoffier, who provided utility that was able to bypass these limitations. And now, 5.7 is introducing Skirk, who's going to be a DPS centered around freeze teams. One thing that's been a topic as of late is that both of their passives gain much more value, with teams that center around having only Hydro or Cryo units. Despite the fact that they don't have all or nothing passives like Nilou or Chevres, this video will cover whether these two Cryo units are niche or restrictive. Disclaimers, timestamps, social media links, music credits, and a link to my Discord server are all down below. Open your textbooks at chapter 5.7.1, today's lesson, a deep dive into teammate stack passives. I have no idea if that's what the mechanic is called, but we're gonna call it that. Okay, so teammate stack passive is kind of a loose term that's not really used by a lot of people, so let's explain what this actually is in the first place. Passives revolving around teammate-based stacks generally utilize elemental types as a means of providing certain bonuses the more or less units you have contributing to the passive. For example, my husband Linny has a passive where the number of other Pyro characters in the party increases the amount of damage he deals against Pyro-affected enemies. And Neuvillette has a pseudo-form of this. His Piss Stream deals more damage based on his teams, but instead of different elements being present, it's different Hydro reactions. This still effectively results in the same concept of having to pick different elemental units to trigger various reactions. There's also racist passives, like how Charlotte gets certain buffs based on whether a character in the party is non-Fontanian or Fontanian, or how Lithic Spear grants certain bonuses based on how many Liyue party members you have. A mechanic like this incentivizes certain playstyles and nudges players into building certain teams. On the flip side, making the bonuses stack is a great way to allow team flexibility. Unlike all-or-nothing characters like Nilou or Chevres, you have the ability to sacrifice a bit of the buffing for the sake of comfortable team building. This mechanic also helps to address damage gaps between different team comps. Going back to Linny, you could run triple Pyro to max out his A4 buff. A good core example is Linny Xiangling Bennett, but then that only leaves room for one slot for a different element. Kazuha can provide a damage bonus and resistance shred for both Linny and Xiangling, but you lose out on a lot of defensive utility, which Linny generally needs. You could also run Zhongli for the shield, but it does mean less offensive buffing. Alternatively, you can take out Xiangling and give yourself the flexibility to run both of our aforementioned supports. In this situation, you take out Xiangling's personal damage, as well as her contribution to Linny's A4, in place of higher external buffing allocated towards Linny. And in the end, yes, there is still a damage gap between these teams, but had Linny not had this passive, the gap would have been much bigger. Now, onto Escoffier and Skirk. I've seen the term monofreeze thrown around a lot, which is just referring to a team comprised only of Hydro or Cryo characters. I might also use the term pure freeze, which is the exact same thing. And if I pull out triple freeze in this video, it just means 3 Hydro Cryo characters with a different element as the flex slot. Both of them are meant to run freeze teams, and their A4 passives are proof of that. Escoffier provides Hydro and Cryo resistance shred the more of these elemental units are present, while Skirk deals higher damage based on the same criteria. The main thing I'm going to cover here is that the bonus massively jumps between stacks. Escoffier's res shred goes from 5 to 10 to 15 to 55%, meanwhile Skirk's damage goes from 110 to 120 to 170% of her base damage. I would argue that both characters are in the same boat as Linny, purely when it comes to the concept of the team building. You want to push a certain kind of team comp with them, that being freeze, but the difference is, the gap between stacks is so big that you experience a much higher loss in utility and damage if you don't run a pure freeze comp. It's kind of like if Linny were to go from a base amount of 60, then go to 80 with one teammate, and then jump all the way to 150 with 2 teammates. Let's go back to our focus characters. Take Escoffier. On the surface, the gap is reasonable when you compare it to an Anemo unit running VV. The artifact can shred 40% elemental resistance based on the swirled element, and if you were to pair them with Escoffier, the shred is still 55%. But there's other factors involved with this. For one, uptime on VV is limited to 10 seconds, which means Your 55% with an Anima unit isn't permanent. Escoffier's A4 has full uptime. VV is also dependent on swirling the right element, which makes it hard to proc against opponents with innate elemental auras. Escoffier's A4 just relies on her skill or burst hitting to proc the shred. And on top of that, when you run Pure Freeze, that fourth slot will be a Hydro or Cryo unit who makes much better use of the Res Shred, as opposed to an Anima unit with lower personal damage. Now with Escoffier, the gap between Triple Freeze and Pure Freeze is definitely noticeable, but I will say it is a valid counter-argument that Escoffier being a support unit gives her much more leeway for having a strong buff in her freeze niche. After all, her kit is meant to improve the damage ceiling for all Cryo or Hydro DPSs in freeze, elevating an entire roster of units, not just herself. If we consider nerfing the number on her final stack, this is also a nerf to them. Skirk basically has the same mechanic, but I am a lot more nitpicky with her execution of it. It's probably because she's a DPS, which has two implications. One, tweaking numbers is less risky because you're mainly affecting her and not the entire team. Second, even if a DPS unit is meant to fall under a specific niche, there is still a lot of value that they get by having flexibility in team building within those niches. Skirk is already within a niche of freeze, but her passive further restricts her with what kind of freeze comps you want to run with her. The bonus between her stacks is so big that even taking into account the utility her triple freeze teams provide, her pure freeze ones are really far ahead. To make it feel a bit worse, Skirk has a special passive that increases the party's skill level by 1, but only when you have a pure freeze comp. This is an all-or-nothing mechanic which very much restricts team building to a certain extent, because you flat out lose this buff simply by running a non-freeze teammate. So let's just compare what Skirk gains and loses in triple or pure freeze. In pure freeze, Skirk has a limited roster of sub-DPS and support units to pick from, but by creating teams around this niche, you deal 170% of her base damage, increase everyone's skill level by 1, and most likely have better energy generation for the other teammates, since same element particles are going to be flying around. Run a triple comp, and your base damage drops down to 120%. You don't get that skill level, and the other party members might have energy issues depending on whether or not they have inherently high ER requirements. But you get access to a flex slot, such as Kazuha, Shilonen, etc. But to be honest, I don't think that's enough to warrant such a massive damage gap. Once again, I like to believe the message of this mechanic should be bridging the gap between optimal and non-optimal team comps. Instead, it feels like shoehorning Skirk into a very niche comp, and the first and second stacks don't feel like bridging the gap, it just puts a little band-aid on to cushion the massive loss. And when it feels like you're simply losing out on too much utility and damage based on one single teammate's element, it inherently does feel very restrictive to me. I want to do a bit of a balancing exercise where we tweak the numbers on both Escoffier and Skirk's passive. First off, we need to address this. The question we're looking to answer with this exercise is not, does tweaking the numbers fix the character's team building? Yes or no questions or this or that questions are generally not good for open-ended discussions, which I want to promote with my channel. So instead, the question is, how does tweaking the numbers affect the character's team building? I want to maintain the idea that Pure Freeze is the intended best team for Skirk and Escoffier, because if you do design a character around this incentive, you actually would be promoting certain characters that would be lesser used in the meta. So instead of, say, defaulting to characters in the Anemo roster for their buffing and VV shred, like Kazuha, Jean, Lynette, etc., you would be incentivized to run characters with other utility, like Candice, Layla, Rosaria, etc. And because I want to maintain the idea that Pure Freeze is the intended best team, the goal with this exercise is not to completely close the gap between different team comps, nor is it to make Triple Freeze's damage better than Pure Freeze. I just believe that there is room to shorten that damage gap between her Triple and Pure Freeze teams, so that her Freeze roster in general feels a bit more even in performance. First method is basically a nerf to the final stack granted in Pure Freeze comps. Let's say Escoffier's Res Shred is lowered to something like 45%, or Skirk's damage buff is reduced to something like 150%. Escoffier has you weighing certain options a bit more than before. Triple Freeze comps still have the highest res shred value of 55%, with Esco's 15 and Vivi's 40% combined, while Pure Freeze is locked at 45%. However, we balance out the options by considering the fact that Vivi has lower uptime and is possibly harder to proc against certain enemies. Esco's 45% shred is numerically lower than 55, but she bypasses both of these restrictions. You balance out the numbers with certain quality of life benefits. And then for Skirk, it's a straight up damage nerf, so the gap inherently shortens. Now, nerfs are obviously not going to be as well received, so we can create a similar result with a buff instead. Instead of lowering the pure freeze stack, you increase the triple freeze stack. Escoffier's 15% is increased to something like 25, and Skirk's 120 bonus becomes something like 140. For Esco, you get a similar result of having a higher value on the triple freeze, being 65% versus 55, but you still have to weigh that number with the quality of life stuff. And then Skirk is just a straight up damage buff in triple freeze, which shortens the gap. This also, however, does not negatively affect her pure freeze teams. By buffing the triple freeze stack instead of nerfing the pure freeze, all of their current performances in the game will remain the same in those team comps. But if you decide to slot in a flex unit, those teams will be buffed by comparison. Depending on the teams you're comparing and how much you want the gap to close, the actual number changes you might make on your end will vary. Maybe for some teams the damage gap is already at a reasonable level, so you wouldn't have to make any tweaks. Overall, I wanted to do this exercise to help you envision the mechanic a bit better, and you can utilize this info when it comes to looking at previous units who have this mechanic, future characters who will have this, or if you plan to make your own character that has to use this. In summary, I don't mind the freeze niche Escoffier and Skirk are in. I do think Escoffier's place in this niche is a lot more understandable, since she's meant to elevate all freeze teams with her passive. With Skirk being a DPS unit, I personally have a higher expectation that she should have more flexible options that remain just as viable. Do I think she needs to be a completely generalized DPS? Of course not. Once again, it's fine placing her into a freeze niche, but it's pushing her into pure freeze instead of allowing room for certain triple freeze comps that makes her feel restrictive in my eyes. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you also believe Skirk is too restrictive, or do you think she's fine as she is? In general, what are your overall thoughts on her numbers and design? Do you plan to pull for her, and what kind of teams will you try out if you do? If you enjoyed this video, consider joining my Discord server, leaving a like, and subscribe to support the channel. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and I will see you all next time. Bye!